Volume 2, Chapter 1 of The Female American, or The Adventures of Unca Eliza Winkfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Our heroine traverses the island. Description of an uncommon animal, with her thoughts thereon. I had matter enough to employ my thought during this interim to reconsider what I had said and what method I should pursue for the future with these people. Besides, I had some domestic cares upon my hands. I now set about preparing a better convenience for my rest by night, and busied myself the remainder of the day, as soon as I perceived the people were gone off the island, with gathering leaves and other things to make my bed, which at last I made pretty tolerable. The next day I removed all the things I had concealed into the subterraneous apartments, bestowing some in one and some in another. I found it necessary also to provide myself with more fat, that I might now want light, and indeed with some meat. For these purposes I was obliged to kill a couple of goats, a task always disagreeable to me. As my habitation was very gloomy and melancholy, I spent what leisure time I had in walking up and down the island. In these few days I saw more of it than I had in all the time I had been upon the island. I found it well watered, with little rivulets, and vast variety of trees, many of which bore different kinds of fruits. Those which I perceived had been pecked by birds I tasted, and found some of them very delicious. Among the various kinds of birds, I found one sort exceeding beautiful. It was about the size of a large parrot, its feathers delightfully variegated with the colors of the rainbow, those of its tail spreading like those of the peacock, but not near so large nor numerous. Of the four-footed animals, I saw one of a most extraordinary kind. It was the size of a large dog, as to its body, but its legs, which were very long, were by no means proportioned to the bulk of this strange animal, being so slender as to bend under him, insomuch that it could move only with the utmost slowness. I wondered within myself how this creature could either defend or provide for itself. But observing it more closely, I took notice that its eyes were uncommonly large for an animal of that size, projecting far from the head, and so frightful as to excite fear in me, and I should have fled from it, only that I perceived it could not overtake me, had I walked ever so slow. The mouth of it was no less dreadful. It kept the lips of it almost constantly drawn asunder, which showed two horrid rows of sharp but short teeth. It was at this time laboring to get into a kind of pasture. I determined to watch its motions, thinking it might be seeking its prey, for I did not doubt but that the goodness and wisdom of Providence, which had thus wonderfully provided for its security, had doubtless taken no less care for its support. It was a long time in getting to the place it seemed designed to reach. As it walked, or rather limped along, several animals passed it, many much bigger than itself, who no sooner saw it than they ran away from it. As it walked, or rather limped along, several animals passed it, many much bigger than itself, who no sooner saw it than they ran from it, as if afraid of being destroyed by it. I took notice that as any of these approached him, he rolled his eyes, which increased their fierceness, at the same time showing his teeth. At length he got into the grass, and then laid himself down, extended as if dead. I came up behind him, for his looks were too terrifying to face him, and sitting down at some distance, was resolved to watch, that I might discover whether he chose this place merely for rest, or with some other view. He soon changed his posture a little, so that I could perceive that his eyes were shut and his lips closed. I therefore concluded that he was going to sleep. However, I still continued in my place. The hair on his body was thick and long, perhaps 5 or 6 inches. The extremities of every cluster of them formed a kind of bunch, or small tuft, as large as a hazelnut. Having sat about a quarter of an hour, I saw a great number of field mice come up to him, who presently began to nibble at these tufts. The animal continuing to lie still, But after a very considerable number of mice had thus employed themselves, he got up and shook himself violently, when, to my great astonishment, I found these mice, some way or other, so fastened and secured to these tufts that very few of them could disengage themselves. And now, his neck being very long, he turned his head and devoured them very greedily, one after another. I dare say that in a few minutes he ate near 300 of them, for his body was almost covered with them. My curiosity was amply gratified, if a human being may say so, of the sudden destruction of such a number of innocent animals. But the divine being has been pleased to permit animals to support themselves by devouring one another. I say permit, for I cannot think that it was the original design of the Almighty that animals should at all destroy one another. I suppose it rather to be one of the unhappy consequences of the general corruption of nature. I know it may be replied that some animals seem by their make to be designed to subsist on animal food only, and are accordingly provided with teeth and claws, unadapted for feeding on herbage or fruits, and with stomachs evidently made for digesting animal substances, whilst these parts in animals who eat no animal food are quite differently formed. I know and grant this, but yet my opinion is not by this concession destroyed. For it is highly reasonable to suppose that these kind of creatures were so formed to prey upon dead animals, that by their feeding upon them, they might remove what would otherwise be a hurtful nuisance, in more senses than one. However, it is not my intention here to display the naturalist. Otherwise, I think, though a woman, I should gain the laurel from an Aristotle or a Pliny, were they to oppose me on this subject. But to return to the event which gave rise to this digression, I should be very glad if I could inform the reader, and especially myself, by what means these mice were entangled by, or fastened to, the tufts of hair, so as not be enabled to disengage themselves, no, not even when the creature shook himself so violently, which one would naturally think was a circumstance in their favor. However, since I am upon this subject, which at least is pleasing to myself, and I think no ignoble contemplation for an ingenious mind, I will hazard my own conjecture upon the occasion. As we know, by the assistance of the microscope, that the hairs of animals are pervious, or hollow, and that they are pervaded by some kind of liquid matter, for their growth and nourishment. Perhaps that with which the hairs of this animal are filled and nourished may be of a more extraordinary glutinous kind, and as the tufts formed by the extremities of these hairs are pretty big, a large quantity of this glutinous matter being lodged there, the nibbling of the mice breaking the hairs, this glutinous matter may so fasten the hairs to the inside of their mouths as to render it exceedingly difficult for them to disengage themselves, at least soon enough to prevent their being devoured. And I think the shaking of the animal must doubly contribute to their danger, because this motion prevents them from fixing their feet against his body, which would assist them in disengaging their mouths from the tufts. And being thus in a hanging state, their fear may make them bite the tufts the closer, upon the motion of the beast, and thereby render them a still easier victim, so that nature seems to have endowed him with this artifice the more effectually to secure his prey. End of chapter 1.